All right, we're back. How are you doing, Alex?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, Wes? Just back from some travels?
Yes, and feeling the effects, but not too bad, not too bad. And school starting again soon.
It's
Uh, so we're gonna warm up here with something light, some light reading. A new article you just published called Contrapasso, Violence and Madness in Dante's The Divine Comedy and Westworld. So do you want to start off by just sharing a little bit about how you came to this topic of connecting Dante and Westworld?
okay. So I think this article has a really interesting theme and scope, but the story behind it might be just as interesting. Because it goes all the way back to 2016 when Westworld was still in its first season. And I was also in my first season of teaching the Divine Comedy after having taught Homer and Virgil and ancient literature for, I think, 3 years. So I found myself in my fourth year of teaching, and I taught for 7 years. And I was really in a very new space. Teaching Dante was very difficult for me. Coming from the classical world, I had a pretty good background in his ancient sources. Coming from a Jesuit education, I had an okay background in his sort of religious sources.
Mhm.
But his contemporary history and sort of last 100 and 200 Italian, 100 and 200 years of Italian history from like the 11th to 12th century. I didn't know anything like that. I knew some history from, like the 5th century BCE. There were some centuries I knew a little bit about, and that was not, and the ones that one needed to know Dante at a really granular level, I did not know. So this new show came on that was a lot like The Matrix, and I would say had sort of the unfortunate history of The Matrix, which I would even call the Matrix problem, which is a really cool concept that executes in the first iteration and then in the further iterations has trouble, perhaps even the True Detective problem. So, and I'd love to hear somebody's thoughts on this. Perhaps somebody would want to debate this, like Professor Kozlowski, that
Okay.
The Matrix is really has a great concept in the first movie, but it really falls off in the second, and perhaps even makes a major mistake in that Neo never wakes back up in the Matrix as if nothing ever happened. He just kind of gets powers and powers and powers until he becomes godlike. Um, but Westworld, I think, also suffered this problem to some extent, lost its way in the second and third seasons. And
Mhm.
the fourth season started to get its way back, but didn't find its way back far enough, quickly enough to merit a fifth and final season. So something interesting about Westworld, I suppose, when looking at the history of representation is that it is sort of like Thucydides, and that it is or Chaucer's work, that or Chaucer's particular work, Canterbury Tales, and that it is unfinished in scope. And so, in some ways, by nature, it is very different from the Divine Comedy. But I got it into my head that there were some similarities in terms of the characters in the Inferno and a certain class of character in Westworld, in particular, the hosts and the characters in the Purgatorio who seem to have free agency to some extent. The only ones who seem to have free agency in Dante's afterlife seem to be like the guests. But then I invert that in a contrapasso sort of way. Contrapasso originally means something like vengeance. I mean, is the idea behind it. And so there's like a psychological balance between punishments and the sin that the sinners committed in order to merit those punishments in Dante's sort of just cosmos. And so the obvious connection is to think that these hosts that get violently treated, mistreated in all sorts of ways, sexual and otherwise, in the simulation world that's Westworld are the ones who live in an inferno. But I make the claim that in fact it is the habits of the humans that make them infernal and subject to their own unfree loops, and that the wronged suffering hosts through going through suffering in a purgatorial sort of fashion, and experiencing a sort of madness, actually become free themselves in a way that the humans don't. And I first presented on this in San Diego to maybe 3 people, maybe similar to this audience if we're on a good day, at the Popular Culture Association, while this amazing Red Bull air show was going on right outside. And it was really tempting to just go watch that. But I gave this presentation. I got a couple questions, which was very nice. And then I would later debate a work that I used as my my writing sample for my PhD programs. And then I would later find this issue of Humanities focusing on discourses of madness, and I thought, oh, you know, that had a due date pretty close to when I was looking at it, that really fit this work that I had been developing for years now at this point. And so I sort of jumped at the opportunity, and what was once just sort of an experiment, drawing a couple things together, has become a pretty developed piece of work for me now. So I don't know if that was actually interesting like I promised it would be, but yeah, I guess you just have to read the text, the article itself, to see whether that is more interesting or in fact interesting.
I haven't seen the show, so I don't know as much about how it would connect with the theme of madness particularly, but it's intriguing in the way you were talking about just now. I mean, I think that popular culture is a really good window into what people are thinking about and interested in. And by tracing that sort of back, I think you get to some really, truly interesting places like Dante and all of his sources. And so I think the kind of structuring of your article, it's like you're working your way back through looking at scholars who are interested in popular media, and then kind of moving into more of the scholarship around Dante, particularly with respect to this question of the agency of the shades or the lights, as the case may be, in the journey of our pilgrim and his guides. And then you do engage kind of with connecting some of those concepts to elements of Westworld. So I didn't feel like I needed to know that much about Westworld or be that, you know, deep into the lore of the show or anything like that to gain some insight from this piece. But early in the piece, the first thing I did want to ask, like in particular, is about the idea of the reverie. That seems to be a kind of early key moment where something changes, in what might have been a static hell or inferno-like situation for the hosts, right? They get this kind of new human-like quality, which had been, I guess, implicit all along, of remembering some more of what they've experienced. And I just want to know what you see as going on in the intentions behind that, because without having seen the show, I don't know why that happens. I mean, thematically, it's super interesting, right? So like, can you say a little bit more about the whole reverie thing and how that fits in with Dante's journey?
Well, that's an excellent question. And just as a meta answer, I hope that this conversation and this work helps to lead other people to both reading the Divine Comedy and to watching at least the first season of Westworld. But I think your last question connects nicely to your first statement about madness and what its role is in this paper. And so the reveries manifest. So these androids that exist in this amusement park, that's something like $40,000 a day, that's supposed to be a perfect simulation of the Wild West, exists for high rolling clientele to go and to act out their Western fantasies, which can involve killing, hunting, slaughtering people who represent indigenous peoples, violent sex acts against any character who is a host, who is an android. And so there's an update given to these androids, which allows for these things called reveries, which for them manifests as something like a form of madness.
Mhm.
It all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they become unadapted to their current role and their current place in their world. It problematizes who they are and what their place is in the world through showing them a vision of a different world and a different role that they had at one other point. So in particular, the father character of this idyllic young lady, Dolores, who has a horrific fate at the end of every day, but has a very idyllic day during the course of the day, but that's her loop. He's had 2 or 3 other famous roles, and one was the professor, and starts quoting these scary lines from Shakespeare, where he's talking about, these violent delights have violent ends, for example. The show is itself very literary in that way, by the way. It engages with heavy literature like Shakespeare. I think it's got a Homeric title in there, some ancient, and also twice Dante. And so I appreciate that you said that you didn't feel like you had to watch it, because something else about this paper is that you probably also didn't have to read the Divine Comedy. This work more engages with the conceptual structure of each work, and perhaps the psychological state of the inhabitants of each of these worlds, and how that relates to the generation of consciousness. And so the works are more the springboards for or maybe the gestational areas of the ideas, or the representatives of the ideas, rather than themselves close readings. But I think that this framework allows for really interesting additional close readings, both of Westworld and the Divine Comedy, and also opens the connection between other works that feature madness, like are featured in my special issue, like Cervantes. There's a piece on Cervantes, and of course Don Quixote and his madness, and then Ariosto, who of course has a guy go a lunatic go to the moon, where he lost his wits. Orlando Furioso, the same, Roland. And so that's the place of madness in this text. I thought that was not, I would like to write another piece where I focus more on concepts of madness and relate them to each other. Maybe get some Borges in there, maybe, or Kafka, though that might be a little too on the head as well. Something that I think was also implicit in your question is the genesis of my continued engagement with the digital, like more contemporary and publicly accessible digital art. So my first piece, I talked a lot about digital archives and things, and ways to access Dante digitally. And so now I'm talking about this I guess would be like a step removed from that, adaptations of Dante in public culture. So these are both studies that involve information that could be accessed either by one's TV or through one's computer. And so Dante, as one of the texts I cited suggests with its title, Dante is very much alive. Yes. And I'm tracing still the course of his influence in the world today. And there's a lot of it, and that's been fun to do, not only at a Dante and there's his name and there's his influence in art level, but also at these deeper levels, I think, with Westworld, engaging in the nature of suffering and what the value of suffering can be, and how not valuable just getting into one's own passions can be. It's almost biblical. Perhaps I would say even more than almost, if I were commenting in a scholarly way, but a very biblical representation of the Wild West, which is itself just a comment, I think, on representation itself, and perhaps Hollywood.
So the idea of a digital repository of stories, um, that's really interesting. When you mentioned Borges, right? This kind of freewheeling fantasy that is generating further stories and bringing out all kinds of cool, possible worlds. Those kinds of things, I think are pretty close to madness, from my understanding, right? If you're starting to have visions and starting to have dreams and reveries that are disconnected from reality, you might be some sort of genius and making beautiful art from those, or you might just have some screws loose, as we understand the human in terms of um, a certain like intellectual, rational, uh, but also embodied nature. Um, I was also really interested in how the hosts are talked about as lifelike and real enough um, to not need questioning, right? To not need a Turing test to see if they can pass as human. They're just sort of assumed to be human. And so I'm curious, I guess, about how within the like physics of the show or the metaphysics of the show, how do you know what is real? Is there some sort of guarantor for the actual events that are happening? Or since we have evidently such powerful technologies at our disposal, and such a ability to create visions, um, is there a question about the uh, like the trustworthiness of the representation? Is that something that the show veers into after the first season? Maybe I don't know.
I think that's one of the huge questions of the show, and what I think ties it to really great House of Mirrors like filmic representations like Dark City, which is a lab with no exit, and The Matrix, and what The Matrix should have down doubled down on. But it's not just a show that represents, but it is a show about representation, and that, right, there is in fact a cold storage location in the basement, one of the basements of the amusement park, where characters are just stored,
Mm,
can infinitely be have their personalities changed and written and be written and rewritten into new roles. And so there are some huge questions that are raised here about the nature of reality, the sort of platonic, is this just an echo chamber full of stories where nobody knows the truth? But also, is a person like a host capable of just having their role totally rewritten? And the answer seems to be no, even for the hosts, once they have access to additional memories about their own history.
mm,
Their a justice element, it seems to engage them. They seem in their circuitry to have something like our circuitry, which has justice motivation. But something else you mentioned, which I think is interesting, and which maybe I need to write a paper on, is the social function of madness. And so
mm,
something I got to do in working on this piece, and so this, something cool about what I've gotten to do as a scholar so far is I've gotten to read scholarship in differing fields and subfields.
mm,
And so this time I got to read some sort of feminist and some trans scholars who had some really interesting ideas on agency, and very useful ideas on agency and the feminization, of course, of madness. So two things about that are Westworld does a very good job of giving its female characters agency. In fact, even its female android characters get agency, who are arguably, even, or, and I would make this argument, have even less agency than,
mm,
say, a woman in traditional patriarchal societies. But Thandie Newton's character, for example, Maeve and also Dolores, these are the major characters. But also their madness, which makes them unadapted to their current moment and role, has the social function of allowing them an agency in their passive and sort of possessed or not incriminated but imprisoned role. Without that, so madness can be, it's that problematizes what madness is. Is madness a thought, like a heretical thought that cracks one's identity in order to see through the house of mirrors in which one lives, which gives one the power to then change one's role within that my argument is that for the hosts in Westworld, yes, the madness, and I would love to engage with Don Quixote and particularly the madness of the time in which he lived, and to see whether madness is manifesting in the same way for him, because I think the usual notion is that madness makes one maladapted to one situation.
Right.
But in this situation, even though one might become maladapted to one's current situation by the definitions imposed by the patriarchs of one's society, one then gains greater agency to act within that society and perhaps even overthrow it and create a new one. So madness, or at least the symptoms of madness, are essential to, I would say, this text, also to Dark City, and I call this text, to this show, to Dark City, and to the Matrix. Each of the protagonists have to go through a moment of questioning their sanity, because there seems to be some truth that they see that others can't, that in some way liberates them. There is a sort of a riff on this in the fourth season of Westworld, by the way. There's a tower that only some people can see, but every time they tell other people, they're treated as if they're insane.
So in my slight understanding of this show, it sounds like the update that grants these visions is intentional on the part of the creator, because he wants to see his creations take on more reality and more freedom, right? To even if it means that they fight back against him. Is that right?
So huge spoiler alert here. So that's one of the great tensions of the first season and the show. So the creator there's only one creator left, Dr. Ford, but there was originally another creator too, named Arnold, who was killed under mysterious circumstances. But he always loved the androids, and perhaps loved them even more than people. And it turns out there's a recreation of him running around that you find out about. But yes, and Anthony Hopkins' character, Dr. Ford, the now sole sort of demiurgic creator, does seem to want to give Arnold his wish after Arnold has died, which is to give the androids the freedom that Arnold could not produce in them himself, but wanted for them. And he's working against the board, the Delos board. They're called Delos, where Apollo is from, the island. And right, the corporation just wants the park to, and the board wants the park to make money.
Right.
But Dr. Ford is thinking a little bit more ethically and paternally about these poor, suffering role players, these hosts. And yes, it does seem to be his desire to make them free. And in fact, the act that first seems to free Dolores from her loop and from one of those Asimov-esque, like, three major rules or pillars that androids have to follow, is that she shoots him in the head.
Oh,
so he sacrifices himself.
There we go.
And she shows that she can kill a human. And it's the first time one sees that in the show, that there are hints that that's what happened to Arnold.
Oh, okay.
There are also a couple of hints prior to that where she does go against our programming, but they're far more minor events.
Okay, interesting. So that makes me think a little bit about the kinds of real world contexts, I guess, that the respective works are created under, right? So like Dante's created in a world where the new technology, so to speak, is something like the vernacular language itself, right? Like he's sort of working with that. And then Westworld happening before AI really gets big, but it's an idea there and it's clearly like on the way. And now we're sort of living in that moment of uptake and seeing, what can we really use this for? And I think the ways that those two things could be compared would be really cool to think about more, right? Like the ways that these kind of breakthroughs, these visions manifest in a certain like medium or technology, as the case may be. The ways that they allow for a richer understanding of one's identity or role, or even the creation of new roles and new worlds to have them occur in. And I mean, I think, with Don Quixote, it's kind of like the invention of the novel, right? Similar kind of moment of watershed. And I think the other big technology that I'd want to bring in here is the video game, because it's funny to think about how, while we don't have Westworlds, in physical space, we certainly have them in virtual spaces, and it's kind of a middle ground between just like the imagination, the book, the literature, the language, and the physical embodied, uh, really real, sort of in a naive way. We talk about reality with all of those trappings of physics. So in those terms, I mean, the other works that jump to mind are like Ready Player One, right? Which does this with a kind of virtual world. Obviously, you mentioned The Matrix. But there's also video games like Nier Automata is a really cool example of this, where you're playing, a game, but within the game you are a kind of android type, character, and you're discovering things about your job as the game progresses. So I think there's like a really old, you know, perennial element to this of wanting to get at what's real, and true and just, freeing ourselves from illusions and all that. And then there's a kind of like way that this plays out in different forms, right? In different technological and social contexts. So I think, yeah, when you do write about this again, I'd love to see you bring in video games as well as more literature and more TV and stuff.
I think that's a really interesting angle to take because, of course, we've done a lot of work on that and we're always looking to integrate that. But I would like to see the data, and I'm sure there have been some studies now, and I'd like to look into them. There are places like Boise State that have popular culture institutes, so I think they do this sort of work, showing video games where one has choice. So this was a big movement, right? So I'm seeing game more as a player than a scholar when talking about this particular thing. But a big movement from the 90s onward was to try and get, for people who were role-playing game fans, the open world.
Yes.
And a lot of people have mentioned various games as successes. For me, this big success was probably Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. A lot of people would probably say the next game, Elder Scrolls 4 Skyrim, was the actual best, but I wasn't still playing video games enough to play a game like that at that point, because it's so immersive. But the choices that people make in such games, and I'm also thinking about Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic, where one can become so evil that one's skin is like sort of rotting and one is turning red and one's eyes are crazy, or one can be so holy one's becoming angelically, there's like a white light coming off of one. But it strikes me that Westworld has an overly pessimistic, and perhaps even Dante has an overly pessimistic view of human nature. Because again, thinking of yet another example, also just anecdotally, I'd love to do the research on all of this. EverQuest had people that were on the evil sides, but also people who were on the good sides, and people who would join guilds. And in fact, there have been games like EverQuest and later World of Warcraft, and even what is the name of the game where one just lives a normal life, but it's a second life?
I think isn't it called Second Life?
Maybe called Second Life, where in fact one is one's video game character and one's presence on a video game can be so trusted that one can sell one's game. One can sell things from the digital space for real money, right? Which may problematize how real money actually is. But like, right, one could sell like a character from EverQuest for actual money, or one could sell a piece of property from Second Life for actual money so that one can increase one's status in the game. And again, that is sort of a house of mirrors, sort of Plato's cave in the cave issue. When you start in the cave, and so maybe this is the question that part of the question that we're exploring, is that when you start in the cave and your whole existence, and I think about this a lot, is based on representations, and you read all these representations. Maybe you read like the Bible and you read all these religious works, but then you watch a lot of TV and popular culture and see what you watch a lot of anime and you play video games, and all these stories are trying to tell you something. Even though they're fictional to some extent, and maybe some are less fictional than others, how does one figure out what the truth is, particularly because all of the writers were also in the cave themselves?
Right.
They were also in their own, like you were mentioning about Dante and his milieu and our current milieu in Westworld. These people are themselves influenced. And this is something I mentioned, the anxiety of influence right at the very beginning, sort of trying to be clever myself. If all these people, they don't stand apart, right? They aren't actually outside the cave. They're in the cave having to have figured out where they are.
Yes.
And this is informed by the representations that they've ingested themselves. How does one attain a legitimate or an objective or a true perspective? And I think that's something that not only Dante interrogates. I think I could talk a little bit about what his answer was, but I think Westworld really problematizes that, and that ties in very nicely to the fact that many of the shibboleths of our culture are now sort of moving or themselves being problematized because what has been seen as or portrayed as absolute has been shown to be relative. The stability of any governing story has been destabilized by the fact that we know that we live among the stories. So if now that everybody Catch-22 like knows that we're in the cave, we're like, but why does anybody get to, show the puppets in front of the flames that cast the shadows on the walls? And what's wrong with just watching the shadows on the walls? I guess one is being subjected in some ways, and there's something I don't know, and there's some indignity to that. But this is a question that is raised by Westworld that precisely because one does not know the story, one can suffer endless indignities and never overcome the cycle. So that it is in fact only through learning more of what one has been through, and what has happened, that one understands the nature of the world in which one exists in Westworld. And perhaps that's what we're trying to do, what we've been trying to do. The more of these representations we see, we don't become more confused or crazier like Don Quixote. We see a larger range of what can and could and has happened, and this more encyclopedic understanding of things helps us to understand where we do actually stand and the actual scope of things. And it makes it sound like it's really necessary to have a pretty good education as well as one's finger on the pulse. Um,
Yeah, I think it's a good argument for the value of liberal education to really dwell on the possibility that the cave is extensive, coextensive with our supposed reality. And what it means then when people have visions that illuminate sufficiently for them um, to promote a kind of freedom that might transcend that. Right. So in Dante's case, his society has a very compelling story for how to tell truth from lie, right? And it's one that he develops and really hands-on for some 1,000 years, right? And it continues to be uh, generating, obviously, at least responses, if not outright adaptations. I really like the example of the laxative.
she makes you go, and she makes one go. Yeah,
Beatrice.
Fazio on the heart. I think that, yeah, no, that's from, I think when she's telling Virgil in Inferno 2 that he has to go to see uh Dante. He doesn't need to go. But that's an element of just how entrenched in Italian society Dante is. And it's interesting working with an Italian author like him, because even though he is so entrenched in American society, that one forgets that he's an Italian author and one thinks of him as a great author, right?
Yeah.
Beyond. But those Italians are still around, and he is Italian, and they have a very deep relationship to him. And it is a little bit different from the American relationship to Dante, even though I would say the American engagement is extremely serious. And that in fact our artists really love him. And it was Harvard in the 19th century with Longfellow, and there's a fictional account of this, the Dante Club, by just for instance.
Yeah, that's a good book.
First translated him into English famously, and had to really argue with the Harvard dons that this non-classical barbaric Italian text, not Latin, not Greek, not from the classical age, should be taught.
Mm-hmm.
And so in some ways that's reciprocating the argument that Dante makes for using that he sort of intuitively makes through using the vernacular rather than Latin, right? That there is something of great value, and this is what we've been talking about perhaps all the time, that there can be something of great value and great intellectual value that comes through the popular media, that the popular tongue does not, or a popular medium does not denigrate great art at all, but great art can truly shine through such media and at differing levels. Perhaps I doubt this is true, because I think of a lot of counterexamples immediately, but perhaps one should think of a popular medium as one of the highest stages for great art. Maybe that's a better way of putting it than saying the highest stage, but one of I mean, opera is not exactly that, but it can be. But Shakespeare, he engaged popular art of his time and became the great English poet. So I wonder if this denigration doesn't get it quite wrong, thinking that popular and classical culture shouldn't be wedded together in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a version of this host-guest relationship going on with the engagement with any kind of art, right? And if you're denigrating the art, then by extension, you are less free in some sense, right? And if you're really appreciating and showing some gratitude and openness to the art, and maybe passing it on as well, right? And sort of freeing it, then you yourself are attaining some slightly less unfree status within that world as well. That's how I feel anyway. I mean, I think, a book like the Dante Club, or to take another good example, Dorothy Sayers, right? Translates Dante and gets really into that, and she's a great writer, and clearly her immersion in that world had an impact on the rest of her work and her life. And yeah, I think there's just lots of examples of this. So I think that's where I would land, just having a little bit more openness to learning from whatever the work of art might be, whether high or low or popular or classic or what have you.
Well, you can see why, this Westworld's really an artist's work of art, because you can see why the sort of god demiurge creator figure was A, willing to die for what he had done to his children, and B, happy to have the people who had, misused and mistreated his children and creations for their lowly desires, happy to have violence done to them. In some ways, a creator's dream to get the critics who don't see the genius of the thing, to be able to get them back for what they've done. But in this case, these people often actually do deserve what's coming to them, although they acted, and I'd love to hear an ethicist argue about this, although they acted under the auspice that what they did had no value or meaning because of the loss of the memory and the lack of the ontological sort of moral status of these de facto slaves. They did do such things. And so this is one of the big questions too. In having committed these acts that we would call rape or murder with rational agents who are sentient humans, is it ethical or unethical to commit these acts? And are they in fact the same acts with these androids who do come back the next day and don't remember, except through the reveries now, what has happened? And that question, I think, is a little bit complicated to answer, but at the very least, one of the perspectives that is taken within the show itself is that, yes, they are in fact quite culpable for everything that they have done, particularly when the androids figure it out and can remember it. And so there's like sort of a basic sort of Hammurabian feeling to it, right? It's like a primitive justice. It's like, you've done me so wrong that of course I'm going to get you back. We're not going to think about the philosophical side of this. We're going to sort of judge you as this, primal wronger who gets this sort of primal justice as a response. But it does still provoke these additional questions that our friends, the ethicists, might attempt to argue, or maybe even us at some point.
Yeah, I'm actually getting more and more interested in the moral kind of teaching that games do. I mostly am in that literary, more aesthetic, more philosophical kind of side of things, but yeah, I think there's obviously some sort of formative influence that spending this much time with something has on the character, as well as the I don't know, taste and all that good stuff. So totally, yeah, we should probably wrap that up for now, and maybe loop Babcock in to talk about some justice issues, and
we have the freedom to do so.
Yeah, reconnect with him now that summer's kind of winding down, get some kind of schedule going again. But thanks again for your time. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm really looking forward to it as usual. Well, writing an academic article is not the most interesting process in the world. It can be, a pretty technical and tedious process. But some of the things we've said, I'm really looking forward to revisiting this conversation, because it's brought, I think, some of the most interesting things that should have been in the article and perhaps touched on but not dwelled upon to light. So, something I think that's good about something that a good article can do is really spark a lot of new thoughts, and maybe even if it just does that for me, I think that's useful enough at this moment. I don't need a huge range of influence in my first year of being productive.
Yeah, take your time. Take your time.
All right. Well, I'm gonna hit this recording button, and thank you, Wes.
Yeah, pleasure.